You are.
Okay, you can all see that. Okay.
It's still not. Yes, now it is in a presentation mood. Yes, listening to the land. Over to you, Jack.
Yeah. So, hello. Sorry about before. My internet cut out. I want to talk about listening to the land, and in particular, thinking about the way that we hear, or the way that we might hear, other than human voices. Okay, so obviously, we're living in a time of ecological crisis, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the moment. But I think this is an opportunity for research in religious experience, spiritual experiences, and those kind of things, to actually make a contribution to understanding how we can better establish relationships with the natural world. So that's kind of the general theme of this presentation. It all kind of, these are all sort of extensions of ideas that I've been exploring in a book published a couple of years ago called Greening the Paranormal, which is all about links between ecology understood quite broadly and anomalistics understood quite broadly as well. So specifically thinking about parapsychology, extraordinary experiences, and those kind of things. And surprisingly, it might seem like these are two very different subjects, but actually there are lots of interesting crossovers and parallels. So we have all of these wonderful contributors who've explored these connections in different directions. So we've got parapsychologists, indigenous scholars, anthropologists, all different people thinking about this issue. So this presentation is an extension of all of this. And one of the main strands that emerged out of the book had to do with non-human consciousness in a range of different forms. So whether we're talking about animals and plants, or spirits, or fairies, or other forms of possible non-human consciousness. And in particular on the ways that we human beings have interacted with those forms of consciousness in different contexts, whether spontaneously in the form of spontaneous extraordinary experiences, or through ritualized interaction. Okay, so lots of interesting stuff there. And then I picked up a little bit more on this recently with a special issue of the Journal for the Study of Religious Experience. We'll talk about Aleister Hardy a little bit, but he obviously started off his career as a biologist, so he was heavily involved in natural history, but also saw religious and spiritual experience as a part of this whole. So he's an important figure in uniting these fields. And in this special issue, we have lots of other interesting explorations. This is freely available. So this is what I want to talk about. The first three sections here are sort of definitions. So I'm going to think about what we mean by the Anthropocene, first of all, then what do we mean by the other than human, and then we'll think about William Stace's ideas or W.T. Stace's ideas of extroverted experience. Then I've got a few examples of extraordinary experiences of nature connection to talk through, some from the archives of the Religious Experience Research Centre. And then I'll finish off with these two sections here, thinking about the role of observation, interaction, and participation in the natural world, and the emergence of the ecological self through this. So this is Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is quite a popular term at the moment. You may have encountered it in lots of different places. But really, what it refers to is this idea that we are now living in a new geological epoch where the activities of humankind are having like a large-scale, geological scale impact on the Earth system. Okay, so there's lots of arguments about when this Anthropocene period began. Some have suggested, this is just one example, you can choose from many different dates, but these guys, Lewis and Maslin, have suggested we could go for either 1610 or 1964. And the date that we choose might influence how optimistic we are about the future. So when they talk about 1610 in the beginning of the Anthropocene, they're talking here about the emergence of colonialism, global trade, the use of coal and all of those kind of things, the emergence of what we can consider like modern scientific industrialization and all those kinds of things. And the second date that they give is 1964, which is actually a year after the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. So their line of thinking here is that, you know, we could go with this one, the 1610 is the beginning of the Anthropocene, when human beings started to mess up the planet, or we could go from 1964, where we showed that actually we were capable of uniting as one, you know, people and making global decisions together. So if we go for the 1610 origin of the Anthropocene, well, you know, these things are continuing, you know, coal burning, oil extraction and all those kinds of things. But if we go with this 1964 date, then we can be a bit more optimistic, because perhaps we can actually pull together and do something about it. And just another little interesting point that ties into this idea of religious experience research attributing to this, to dealing with the Anthropocene. The philosopher Donna Haraway says, "I think it's our job to make the Anthropocene as short or as thin as possible, and to cultivate with each other in every way imaginable epochs to come that can replenish refuge." So we should be thinking of ways to actually bring this Anthropocene to an end, or shift it into a new direction. One of the major symptoms of the Anthropocene is the loss of biodiversity, as we know. All of the different animal species that we're losing, plant species. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction at the moment. You know, an event equivalent to like the extinction of the dinosaurs and that kind of thing, but largely due to, as we've just seen, human impact. So there's obviously, you know, something that we can do to change this. And there's a lot of research now as well into what I consider psychodiversity. So my idea is that, you know, we talk about biodiversity as all of the living things, the biomass, but accompanying all of that biomass are minds and intelligences, you know. So Monica Gagliano's recent research has been very influential, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But she's basically demonstrated through lots of very novel experiments that plants are capable of learning. You know, they have memory storage, even though they don't have brains. They can use sounds to communicate, and all sorts of interesting things that we didn't think they were possible, you know, capable of doing. Okay, so it's clear then that when we're talking about plants and trees, you know, we're not just talking about biomass, we're also talking about consciousness or mind behind there, whatever form that mind might be. And then we could also add into this all of this new research that's showing that, you know, things like culture, which we've taken to be definitive of human beings, are actually found in many, many different kinds of non-human species. You know, so birds, whales, fish, you know, species that are very distantly removed from us, like fish, you know, possessing culture, quite an interesting thing, as in the ability to hand on information from one generation to the next. Okay, so again, all of this adds to this idea that we're talking not just about biomass, but about minds as well. So this is really important. And this little quotation here brings this home, I think. So when you have pronounced cultural differences, e.g. between, you know, bat populations, losing populations is tragic because you're losing these animal cultures that have been built up over many years. They hold many local solutions to specific problems or unique mating preferences not found anywhere else. Okay, so biodiversity loss is much more than just the loss of biomass. It's also the loss of, you know, cultures and other ways of being and other ways of thinking. Okay, so it's an important point that biodiversity is also psychodiversity. And this is an interesting point, because when we look at indigenous traditions, this distinction is, you know, not made. Living things, plants and animals are assumed from the to possess personhood, you know, from the very get-go. Even things that in the West we would consider to be completely non-living, like stones and rivers and things, may also possess personhood, you know, from an indigenous perspective. So there's an interesting illustration of this idea in the writings of the anthropologist Alfred Irving Hallowell. He did a lot of research with Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people, and in many ways kickstarted the ontological turn in anthropology. But he said, amongst the Anishinaabe, in the metaphysics of being found among these Indians, the action of persons provides the major key to their worldview. So what he's saying is that the Ojibwa cosmology is all about relationships between persons. And key to this is that not all of these persons are human. They include in their category of personhood, like we're saying, plants and animals, rocks even, but also ancestors, spirits, essentially, non-physical persons as well. Okay. Graham Harvey has kind of summarized all of this thinking. There was an old animism, which came from E.B. Tyler, the anthropologist, and essentially saying that animism is just a faulty belief, really, of primitive way of thinking. But all of this new work since Hallowell, building on exploring animism as an ontology of relationship, is kind of summarized here quite nicely with Graham Harvey's new animism. So he says, animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Animism is lived out in various ways that are all about learning to act respectfully, carefully, and constructively towards and among other persons. Persons are beings rather than objects who are animated and social towards others, even if they're not always sociable. Animism is more accurately understood as being concerned with learning how to be a good person in respectful relationship with persons. So this is actually a key feature of many indigenous ontologies, that it's all about establishing a good relationship between human persons and other than human persons, whether they are animals or spirits. Okay, so this is where we're entering into the territory of mysticism. Because, in the Western world, we find these similar kinds of perspectives emerging from, similar perspectives to indigenous or animistic traditions, emerging from religious and extraordinary experiences. Okay, so W.T. Stace, as we probably all know, made a distinction between introverted and extroverted mystical experiences. So an introverted experience is an internal experience. It might be visions or hallucinations or subjective experiences, whereas an extroverted experience specifically seems to transform the external environment. And he points out that in these experiences, very often there's a sense of like underlying unity that emerges from this, which brings it into the domain of classical mystical experiences. So he says, the extroverted mystic with his physical senses continues to perceive the same world of trees and hills and tables and chairs as the rest of us, but he sees these objects transfigured in such manner that the unity shines through them. The extroverted experience is sensory intellectual insofar as it still perceives physical objects, but is non-sensuous and non-intellectual insofar as it perceives them all as one. Okay, so this is the key point he's trying to make about these experiences, is that they reveal, even though they're external experiences, they reveal this underlying oneness, which he thought was a key feature of mystical experiences. So now I just want to have a look at a few different experiences which we might consider to be extroverted experiences or nature mystical experiences. So here's one from Aleister Hardy, described in a paper by David Hay. He says, "There's no doubt that as a boy I was becoming what might be described as a nature mystic. Somehow I felt the presence of something which was beyond and yet in a way part of all the things that thrilled me, the wildflowers and indeed the insects too. I will now record something that I have never told anyone before, but now that I'm in my 88th year, I think I could admit it. Just occasionally, when I was sure that no one could see me, I became so overcome with the glory of the natural scene that for a moment or two I fell on my knees in prayer, not prayer asking for anything, but thanking God, who felt very real to me for the glories of his kingdom and for allowing me to feel them. It was always by the running waterside that I did this, perhaps in front of a great foam of meadowsweet or purple loosestrife." Pretty cool experiences that he's having, triggered by natural settings. So here's another example of what we might call a form of like paranormal communication. This is from Monica Gagliano's book, Thus Spoke the Plant, which was published a couple of years ago now. It's a great book where she describes her own personal experiences of shamanistic engagement with plants, alongside her scientific, mainstream scientific research on things like plant intelligence. And what's really interesting is that her experiences of communication with trees and plants actually influence or inspire her experimental procedures. So it becomes a collaboration between the plants and her own research. So she says, this is talking about what she did was she would do these dietas, where she would go and spend time, stay the night, in a circle with a tree. She wouldn't consume any food other than, bits of the bark of the tree. So they're having a real intimate connection. And in the midst of this sort of ritual, she describes this, but Sakoba's silent and motionless appearance was deceptive. Sakoba's the tree. She had no intention of waiting till nightfall before bearing her next teaching session on the perception of reality. While in plain sight, everything disappeared for a while for me that afternoon. The hut and the hammock I was swinging in dissolved, although I was still there. I had not moved and my eyes were wide open, but what I was seeing was somewhere not there. Sakoba was there. Ah, you got it, she said without words. Without words, I asked, I got it, what? And then I saw the answer, a bright, shiny road. Okay, so interesting experience. So Monica Gagliano's experiences have influenced her scientific research, and through bringing about this new scientific appreciation of plant intelligence, it's sort of shaking our culture up a little bit to think about, like I was saying before, this issue of psychodiversity. Another similar experience was reported by well, he wasn't initially a naturalist, but he became a naturalist, Aldo Leopold. Initially, he was a wildlife warden for the US government, and in the 1920s, it had been his responsibility to basically clear the national parks of, well, actually, he may have initiated national parks, but clear the wilderness, basically, of wild animals, because the idea was that, if you could get rid of the wolves, then there would be more deer for hunting. And we know now from trophic cascades that this is actually totally the wrong way of thinking. And Aldo Leopold realized this too when he was about to kill one of the last wolves in Yellowstone. So this is what happened during this experience. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. Okay, so again, transformative experience in nature that leads to a greater sense of, in fact, it leads to what he called his land ethic, like a new ethical system for engagement with the natural world. So I'll just show you another couple of experiences. These ones are from the archives of the Religious Experience Research Center. And you'll see these similarities to what we've just been talking about. As I watched, suddenly the whole countryside changed and everything in it, without exception, simply glowed with luminous light. It seemed no longer to be lit by the sun, but by its own internal radiance. Some light was not reflected from it, but I myself and everything else seemed to have become light, which now interpenetrated and shone through our previously dense physical forms. The whole scene shone with an extraordinary golden glow, which included the sky and the atmosphere itself. This one is interesting. Some 12 years ago, I used to have 4 tall elm trees on our garden lawn. They grew forming a square. I was strongly drawn to these trees and used to stroke the trunks and talk to them, especially when I felt depressed or ill. I always felt their response through a strong vibration through my hands, then through my whole body. This convinced me that I am one with all beings. The same life force which flows through my body flows through all vegetation, animals, birds, fish, minerals, under the ground or sea, even the very stones we walk on. Every animate and inanimate thing is held together with atoms which are of the whole divine being. So this sounds very much like a kind of animistic perception, or we might call it like a mystical animism. Yeah, I'll just give a couple more just to drive the point home. As we conversed, the situation became unreal. The plants and shrubs and the 3 pine trees in the copse became unreal, and yet they were more real than I had ever seen them in the 3.5 years I had lived there. Instead of merging into a general familiar pattern, each item of plant, shrub, and tree stood out singularly, vivid, vibrant. The whole area became something on its own apart from the rest. The whole area became something I'd never seen before. I became filled with a feeling of elation and well-being such as I've never before or since experienced. I felt that I had seen nature as it really is. Oh, I have to read this one as well because this one is amazing. This one is actually from the First World War. And it's an account from one of the soldiers who's sort of after a battle, basically. Okay, he says, the nearer I drew to the village, the more alive the surroundings seemed to become. It was as if something which had been dormant when I was in the wood were coming alive. I must have drifted into an exalted state. The moon, when I looked up at it, seemed to have become personalized and observant, as if it were aware of my presence on the towpath. A sweet scent pervaded the air. Early shoots were breaking from the sticky buds of the balsam poplars, which bordered the canal. Their pleasant resinous odor conveyed goodwill. The slowly moving waters of the canal, which was winding its unhurried way from the battlefields to the sea, acquired a numen which endorsed the intimations of the burgeoning trees. The river conveyed that it had seen me before in other places and knew something about me. It was now concerned with my return to the village. A feeling that I was being absorbed into the living surroundings gained in intensity and was working up to a climax. It's a perfect illustration of this idea of slipping into a state of consciousness where you see the world as alive. And it's interesting to point out that this effect is not just found in these mystical experiences, but also occurs in or other kinds of extraordinary experiences like alien abductions, psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, all have been associated with enhanced nature connection. So this is just an example from John Mack, because alien abductions are quite an extreme form of extraordinary experience. But it's interesting that we have this common thread that runs right through from mystical experiences to abductions. He says, it seems impossible to avoid the observation that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of a planetary ecological crisis that is reaching critical proportions, and that information about this situation is often powerfully conveyed by the alien beings to the experiences. So interesting. And there's a few different ways that we can think about that. It could be that these are beneficial, you know, they're good aliens and they're trying to give us information. Which I find quite difficult to imagine, because a lot of these abduction experiences are very negative and frightening. But what it seems to me is that they actually, all of these experiences are based on a sort of enhanced sense of what I would call ecological consciousness. And it's being in that state, maybe the experience initiates the state, or maybe having the propensity to slip into ecological consciousness allows these experiences to occur more frequently. But there definitely seems to be some relationship between, you know, this idea of ecological self, which I'll talk about now, and extraordinary experiences. So I've just got a couple of little other examples here of sort of hidden forms of animism, but they also hint at how these animistic insights emerge. So I was a few years ago working on a permaculture project, which is all about, permaculture is basically like it's organic farming systems that are inspired by natural observations of nature, basically. And in my conversations with people involved in permaculture, they would describe things that were almost like extraordinary experiences. So this example here from this guy who's involved in willow cultivation. He says, I first got into willow quite by accident, if I'm honest. I inherited a piece of land in mid-Wales, tried to make a living from the land, tried to make a living in various different ways. All of them failed. In the meantime, I planted some willow on a piece of wet ground because I couldn't think of anything else to do with it. So I inadvertently applied the permaculture principle of listening to the land. This is a key bit here. And actually observe and interact is the first principle of permaculture. And let the land dictate what you do. So it's like allowing the land to communicate. And now I have a willow business, and all the other businesses completely failed. Even before I heard of permaculture, I was following permaculture principles. And that led me to Willow. So you could say Willow discovered me rather than me discovering Willow. So that led me to do a little research project on permaculture and extraordinary experiences. I didn't find that much stuff, but some intriguing little tidbits. And then just very quickly, I've seen other examples of similar kinds of ideas, personalized relationships with the natural world emerging when I've been working with Welsh laborers in their mid to late 70s, where we've been building stone walls or making wooden fences and things like that. But they would refer to stones and trees as him or her, even though they're not necessarily, I think if I was to ask them, do you really think that this tree is a person? They would probably say no, but I've subsequently found lots of stuff in the Welsh tradition and the folklore about trees, and in the language about trees and plants being personalized, personified anyway. So there are all of these interesting little bits and pieces. Another one was when we were having a cup of tea and the wind blew, and it was actually my father-in-law. He said, "Oh, Morris a Gwent," and Morris a Gwent is a. I said, what do you mean Morris a Gwent? And he said, "I'm surprised you haven't heard that growing up in Llangrannog." And subsequent research revealed that Morris a Gwent is actually like a trickster element in a nursery rhyme. And there's a Welsh nursery rhyme where the wind and the rain come and they knock your hat off, when it's windy and stormy, and they personify it in that way. So the thing that binds these together is that these old guys who are referring to trees as him and the rocks as him, constantly working out in nature, in the natural world. They have been working outside for years and years, and they still do it even though they're nearly 80 now. Again, there's a long association of mystical experiences being induced in natural settings. There's even books about it. It also relates to Levi Bruhl's idea of participatory consciousness. The idea that he thought primitive people were constantly in this state of participatory consciousness, which may be true to some extent. Tanya Lerman summarizes this idea. One experiences one's mind as participated in by another awareness and as affecting that other awareness, that the outer world is full of intentional interactive consciousness, a mystic influence which is communicated under conditions themselves of mystic nature from one being or object to another. So this is what we mean by ecological self. That when the self isn't something that is bounded and solid and discrete, but actually we can experience parts of the environment as a part of ourselves in interesting ways, and we can have interactions with personalized elements of the environment. So Arnie Ness talked about an ecological self, and he said that essentially the ecological self was when we come to realize that, or identify the external world with the internal world. When we realize that there is no distinction between outside and inside, essentially. The resonances here with mystical experiences and out-of-body experiences and things like that are really pronounced. He doesn't give a definition of the ecological self, but he describes it as a process. Basically, the ecological self of a person is that with which this person identifies. This key sentence, rather than a definition about the self, shifts the burden of clarification from the term self to that of identification, or rather process of identification. Okay, so it's all about how we engage with the world and identify with the different parts of it that we interact with. Freya Matthews, the philosopher, has also talked about the ecological self. She talks about holistic nesting of a self in a wider self system. Okay, so that we're actually all parts of, we're kind of nestled into this wider system of selves. Very animistic way of thinking. We're all sort of connected, but we're also individual. So individuality in this framework is thus a relative matter. It's a function of involvement in a wider system. The individual is thus, in a very real sense, a microcosm of the wider self in which it occurs. So my thinking is that when we slip into these states of realization, that we're slipping into, what parapsychologists have described as psi-conducive states, or what scholars of religion have talked about as religious experience conducive states. Okay, so nearly finished now. Joanna Macy talks about the ecological self as well. She says, once we tune into our interconnectedness, responsibility towards self and other become indistinguishable because each thought and act affects the doer as much as the one done to. So this is the breakdown again. Just as an amputee continues to feel twinges in the severed limb, so in a sense do we experience in anguish for homeless people or hunted whales, pain that belongs to a separate part of our body, a larger body than we thought we had, unbounded by our skin. Okay, so here's my conclusions, brief conclusion. The sense, I'm not even sure I mentioned this in the talk, but the sense of disconnection that has emerged, I think, from the Anthropocene might lead to experiences of connection to nature being understood as paranormal, or at worst, pathological, because our culture has made such a big distinction. Whereas actually these experiences, if had within a framework that is accepting of them, may actually represent, genuine conversations or genuine interactions with intelligences in nature. Okay, so that's one major issue that we have with our Anthropocene. But religious experiences of all different kinds might actually have an important role to play, and especially research on these states in understanding the ways that this sense of connection is actually established. So maybe we need to do more research in that direction. It also might help to understand, the nature of the ecological self, this thing that we've been talking about, with more descriptions of it. And then the other key point that emerges from all of this is that it's the process of observation, interaction, and participation with the natural world, whether, we're working, building stone walls, or we're having a dieta with a tree, or whatever, and we slip into a state of reverie, that it's these that are responsible for inducing these feelings of mystical connection and paranormal communication. Not to say that it explains it, but it's a necessary precondition in order to have those experiences, to observe, interact, and participate in the world. And ultimately then, and although it's a kind of a roundabout way, research on extraordinary experience, religious and mystical experiences, might actually have a role to play in the process of biodiversity restoration, through acknowledging the parallel importance of psychodiversity in all of this, and the different ways that human beings have engaged and interacted with these other than human forms of consciousness. So there we go. I just thought I'd mention briefly the MA in Ecology and Spirituality, because if you are interested in these issues, then we explore them in some depth on the course, and you can find out more about it there. And there's some references.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Okie doke.
I need to switch here to gallery view. Yes, yeah. So thank you very much. Perhaps I should also mention that part of the MA is also the module on religious experience today, which is one of my modules around the Emirates religious experience, just to make also some advertisement for us. Thank you both speakers for these two very excellent papers looking at the research on religious experience from different disciplines, from different approaches, but both showing us how we are studying, how we are doing research in these areas. Marta focused on identifying positive and negative impacts and how to distinguish between positive and negative experience, and showed us the example that the majority of the people interviewed, despite of having a negative diagnosed in hospital, nevertheless had a positive reflection on experience. And Jack showed us how research on experience in line with the interaction with nature can reveal a different type of self and ecological self. And again, both excellent viewpoints. We have already the first handout. Just before I give Misbah allow Misbah to speak the question. Because both papers run a little bit over time, I hope you don't mind that we are also running over time with the panel. And so I will extend a little bit the time if you don't mind. And so Misbah, your question? You are muted, Misbah, and so I don't know if you want to say something, then please unmute. Okay, perhaps there's a problem, and so then perhaps in the chat room is a comment from Matthew, Matthew Arnold. Do you want to say something more?
Can you hear me now? Ah,
yes.
It's too many buttons to press.
Yeah.
Brilliant talk, Jack. Thank you very much for that. Both my wife and I set up something called a forest church, which was to explore the divine within the natural world as part of our interfacing with the neo-pagan cultures within our area. And we've learnt a lot from both that community and the experience. And yes, it's very much participatory with creation, rather than a dominion-based top-down approach. It's an up from the bottom up approach. But yeah, when I saw the photo of the willow domes in that picture, I had my own experience of being a pioneer minister in an old mining community that had been fractured and broken, and we kind of discerned that the landscape had been damaged, I would say, by the ripping of its guts out, basically. And there was a piece of land that was just an old dog toilet, basically. People would just walk their dogs over there, and it was not a pleasant place. So one of the projects I was involved in was Plesley Community Orchard that planted 70 odd fruit trees of a variety with a couple of willow domes. And it was having finished doing the willow domes and picking up the little pieces, because those things will self-plant and you'll just have a complete willow halt if you're not careful in your orchard. And as I picked them up, I'd put all the tools in the wheelbarrow, I'd wheeled it back round to the guy's house, came back into the orchard. The sun had just set. I was just at the top of the orchard looking down, and I just got a hug. And it was just a proper hug. There's nobody else in the orchard, and I thought, yeah. And it felt like it was a thank you for bringing me to fruition. I'm kind of fairly thick-skinned in terms of being as sensitive as it were. But I thought, yeah, there is something or someone here that is very thankful for what we've done. And I don't think it was necessarily human.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing this excellent experience, which makes Jack's point. And so thank you very much for telling us your experience. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yes, I would really like to just thank you from the bottom of my heart. Don't want to be too gushing, but it's such a relief to know that these types of analyses, not just perspectives or opinions, but analyses, are finally coming into academia. I've been working on this. Well, I had a particular experience when I was 7 years old, which set me off. And I've worked as a country. I've sent you a private note, by the way, including I was on the council of the Aleister Hardy Trust in the 90s. I worked at Westminster College. I was an academic exploring so many of these areas. I now run a transpersonal eco-psychology module at the Aleph Trust with where David Luke, one of your contributors, I noticed, is also. I've been trying to get this through for years, but I came into academia as a mature person and I just had to make a living and there was no interest in it. So just thank you. It's so very important for now. It really is. I would like to encourage you to look more at Aleister Hardy's hypothesis, because it is that spiritual experience can, and a lot of my students say it does, but I would say it can bring about an ecological orientation, but it not necessarily. And something about the psychology of what makes the difference between someone who uses a technology, a technique, be it experience in nature or psychedelics or whatever it might be, what makes the difference between that translating into actual lifestyle and behavior change and not is a very important question. Yeah. But I think that's a very important trajectory through which to really explore the hypothesis that religious experience and religion and spirituality in general, what I call a contextualizing orientation rather than a consuming orientation, how important this is for our future survival as a species. I think I can say this now with, I've always felt confident about it, but it feels now that it can be spoken about without people getting embarrassed and tabooed by it. So just thank you. And I'd like to be in touch.
Definitely.
And I've put my website on next to my name, if anybody wants to have a look at some of my work going back to the mid-90s on this sort of thing, on spiritual experience and spirituality as an evolutionary trajectory and the blocks and catalysts to the transformations we need. So just thanks a lot.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Can you put it on your website also in the chat room, because not everyone
oh sure, yeah,
a little bit too small to see it. Thank you.
Right.
I just want to mention that Marta is at the moment writing 2 articles on Aleister Hardy to make him more known in Brazil, and so we will hopefully get in future also more people to look into Aleister Hardy's work from the other perspective. June, you are next.
Yes, I mean, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack. I think that's absolutely wonderful. I'm thinking of looking at, well, I'm buying actually, the mechanism called The Sound of the Plants. Is that based on Maria Gagliano's work? Because that's coming from Italy. It involves attaching the electronic receivers to the petals and receiving the sounds in audible form. That's the first question. Second one, I wondered if you knew Bernie Krause's book, The Animal Orchestra, in which he talks about geophony, biophony, and anthropophony, and how anthropophony, which includes music, but also cars and aeroplanes, has systematically over the last 100 years been obliterating biophony and geophony, and that's why I'm going to buy the plant audibility. The last thing is a personal reflection. When I was a child, we read things like Peter Rabbit and Little Grey Rabbit and all these, and Wind in the Willows, and these were all wonderful because all these animals were our friends. And then when I went to school, I was told they were anthropomorphic, and this was completely wrong. And I wonder if we need to reconstitute those books, which did play an immensely important part in that notion of us as human beings. I wanted a little grey dress with white collar and cuffs, which was what the rabbit wore. And indeed, I had one because I was so related to her. I just wonder whether that notion that they were all anthropomorphic and totally wrong needs to be revisited, as to the flower fairies and all of that. So Bernie Krause, Sound of the Plants and the Flower Fairies, can you make some comments on them?
Well, I'm not sure whether the the device that you're talking about is directly related to Monica's work, but it could be. But I know that there has been a lot of research along those kind of lines, going right back to the 60s and 70s, researching, you know, the sort of physiological responses of plants with electrodes and all sorts of different kinds of things. So yeah, and I think that those kinds of devices could be useful because they provide a very easy way to establish a dialogue, don't they?
Yeah.
It could be useful in that sense. And yeah, with relation to the children's stories, I think yes, we should be, you know, thinking along those lines and encouraging those kinds of relationships. And the funny thing is that although it might seem like, you know, fairy tales, the science is there as well, because the conscious, you know, with plants, for example, I mean, clearly they have some form of consciousness beyond what we've generally wanted to give them credit for. It's not that far removed from, you know, the flower fairy idea or the devas or those kinds of things. So super interesting area to be thinking about.
And you know Bernard Krause, do you? You know the book?
No, I don't. That sounds like a good book, though.
Yeah, The Animal Orchestra, it's called. And he does a detailed investigation of how human beings gradually lost touch with biophony and geophony. And of course, until we could build houses, all anthrophony was in relation to biophony and geophony, because you couldn't keep the sounds out.
Yeah.
It was only when we managed to finally put windows and doors in that we managed to exclude those sounds. So most of human music making has been in association with biophony and geophony, so they have been together.
That's great. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing the book also to our attention, June. Thank you. I have a question to Marta. You mentioned the chapter, the article where the fruits or the way the experience comes out or is interpreted is a way to distinguish whether it is a disorder, a psychotic phenomenon, or whether it is spiritual, religious experience. But how do you make the distinction? Because not every experience has such a way to really analyze and distinguish between negative and positive. And so can you elaborate a little bit more about how to distinguish between a pathological experience and a spiritual experience?
Okay, thank you, Bettina. It's a very good questions. I was worried about the time, so I didn't explore enough this subject. But in William James, we can read deeply about how he did the difference. He considered the difference when it's considered healthy and genuine religious experience. If with this experience that it's named by himself or herself as a religious experience, he feel more connected with himself or herself and with the others. If these fruits, it's solidarity, for example, love and connections, and not selfish, not violence, and not bad for the connection with the others, with the world. If they maintain in connections, if the fruits is good for herself and for others, so it's considered a genuine experience. Oh, he studied many famous saints in the history and poets, religious in over part of the world. So when it's not, the result is not good, it's selfish, it's not connected with others, with the life, with sense of reality, with sharing the life with others. So it's transformed in a isolating and selfish, and doesn't have the overcoming, because sometimes it need to be isolated sometimes, but after the spirit of isolation, It could return to the society, to the others, to the community, and return good things for the people around. So that it be good. It's not, the fruit doesn't mean that there is no suffering. In the genuine experience, maybe it's also an experience that causes some suffering for himself, or maybe for the others also, because when he is isolated, people will be preoccupied about him, worried about her health, her conditions. But after that, if we return it to the people, it's good fruits. So that is why, in general, as William James distinguishes the good fruits, for example. And in the case of Jackson in Fulford, they use the psychotic phenomenon, for example, symptoms like hallucination or visions or delusions. It's very similar. It's similar in psychopathology. We have even the concept of religious hallucination, religious delusions, for example. So sometimes it's very difficult for professionals who work in this area to distinguish if it's common in this kind of religion, it's considered normal or not, is a symptom of pathology. So Jackson in Fulford considered the trunk as the psychotic phenomenon. So they use the psychiatrist's criteria also, but not only the traditional psychiatrist traditionals to judge if it's good or bad. They use the values. If this experience is linked to these values in the group, and the result is good for his readaptation to the life, to deal with a stressful situation, to make sense in his own life, and there is connection with others. It's gave him to more empowerment in the life, autonomy, for example, linked to the religious values, though it's good, but instead to do that, there is no insight, there is no link with society, there is no link with the values. So it's isolated, so it's bad. There is alienation of reality. There is no connections with the language, with the reality, with the society, so it's not good. So, but in this case, the name that they gave is psychotic phenomenon, not religious experience, but they say that it's good and bad psychotic phenomenon. They distinguish like that. So it's in resume. I would like quickly to show something that I forgot at the end. I forgot to present the reference.
For this. Sorry.
No,
can you switch it off, please?
Okay.
Sorry.
I do that. Just a second. I try to.
No, please stop.
Yes, I do that. I need to find it. I don't know how to do that again. Sorry.
Right.
I need.
Can you? Yeah, thank you.
Right there, yeah.
Thank you, Martha. And I'm sorry that I need to stop you, but
Okay.
I had 3 hands up, and so I want to give them the time for question before we have to come to an end. And so Jane was first, and then Elle, and then Sneha. And so Jane, it's your turn.
Me?
Yes.
Not Jane. If it's me, I would just like to say that the last talker, I was absolutely blown away by him because I emphasized everything he said. And I've been having these very, very strong experiences over the last few years, which I can't really talk to anybody about because they think you're crazy. I've mentioned them to Methodists, Catholics, and Protestants, and all sets imagination. What I had is I suddenly found, first I had lights, after my husband had died, lights around when I was feeling very sad. And then several years later, when I moved to Woodstock, I suddenly found these, what I thought were orbs floating around my bedroom. and I couldn't understand what was happening, what it was. But since then, I've discovered that when I was doing meditation in my garden, that in fact they're not orbs, they're shafts of light which come down from the sky, and they're round at the end, but they have a golden part in the middle which can actually come out of it. And now I go into Blenheim on my mobile scooter because I'm a bit disabled, and I see all the time these shafts of light coming down and floating among the trees. And it's become, you know, a daily thing, part of my life, but I can't really tell people because they don't seem to understand. So it was wonderful to hear that talk today and to know that other people are experiencing. The other thing, I can see energy. And the last concert I went to, there was a wonderful Japanese pianist, and I could actually see the energy coming out of her head and also on her fingers as she was playing. So it's a sort of gift of second sight, which I suddenly acquired. But I would love to be in contact with our last speaker so that I could, you know, find out more and maybe tell them more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And you will be delighted to hear that one of my PhD students who works on orbs and religious experience, Mara Steenhuisen, I think she will speak at the Oxford event in October for the Aleister Hardy trust. And so you will hear more about orbs then in October and from Mara. Elle, you are next.
Okay, this is just a brief comment, both on Marta and Jack. It seems historically we think of mysticism as being a very self-contained kind of experience, but in what Marta is talking about and Jack is this sense of relatedness, which is an outgrowth, but also part of the mystical experience itself. There's this larger relatedness. And it just, to me, it comes back to William James, who started out the premise of varieties of religious experience was based on the human in relation to something. And it just seems like it's a bit of a juxtaposition in what we have historically thought about, maybe a more isolated relation, and these two speakers talking about that opening up to a larger world.
Yeah, thank you, Elle. I also thought Marta's and Jack's, it's about relationships, about looking at the world in relation to others and not individual. It's the common theme. Thank you. Snea, you had your hands up in between. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity, and I love both the talks and the one in the morning. My question is actually to both the speakers, and it's mostly two parts. The first one is, these are really very, very intimate experiences of people. To what extent is we as researchers can read into these experiences, and when should we draw that line? That's one. And the second one is, how do you translate these experiences into texts? You know, you have to write about these experiences. So how, like, what is the main challenge? And if you could just give me some sort of, you know, ways in which you've overcome those challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, who wants to start first? Jack, Marta?
I will just say a quick thing about that. I think we have to a certain extent, go with the written accounts that we have available to us, and we haven't got any choice but to interpret them ourselves. Obviously we shouldn't be imposing like a framework onto it, a rigid framework, but I'll actually let the experiences speak for themselves and to show us the categories and differences. So we can't, obviously we could go and we could interview people in more detail and things like that, but in terms of like the experience I was talking about from 1917, that's the only piece of evidence that we have related to that experience, and we have to, you know, treat it as our data. So we've got to be careful, but we also got to be aware of the limitations and what we actually have available to us.
Marta?
Yes. So let's take the. Okay. That it's the second question is about how to translate it, this experience in language. It's not easy. So it's because of that it's frequently used the arts as a way to express the deeply experience, and sometimes there is no words to translate it. So they use metaphors, a lot of metaphor. And when we are studying about this, we need to use the scientific language sometimes to communicate between scientists. It's a big, big challenge. This is one of the reasons that I work in the phenomenological approach, that is allowed to use the sensible language, not only the positivism and the technical language, but we really need to know how to communicate with scientists, with mental health professionals and other professionals. So we need to explain and at the same time to be expressiveness when we translate it. We need to be very careful. For example, I read here the message written by a consultant psychiatrist. He told that he tried to be very careful when he are listening people about religious experience, because the way that we hear this experience and the way that we translate it can be change the real experience. So we need to be very careful to listen and to translate it and to try to communicate about that. We need to conciliate sensibility and good language to communicate. And the metaphor used to be helpful in this context also.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps just to add from my own work on in this field, I interview people and of course also participate in observation, but mainly interview, and so different from what Jack mentioned. But in the same way, I also have to be careful when I analyze what they're telling me, because it might be that they're telling me something because I'm asking the question and coming from a different cultural background, and so it's also about not imposing, as Jack said, our way of thinking on them, but also making sure that they are in a situation where they can speak openly about it and not being afraid not to be ridiculed. And so it is quite a balance and difficult, but I think this is why we like to study these types of experience, because it's difficult. And I think Andy, I think there were in the chat room one or two more. I know it was what Marta
No,
mentioned.
I think Martina, that people just making a point or just passing on the information. Yes, there's no specific questions.
Yeah. Well, we run a little bit over time, but not too much. Well, 20 minutes, and so it is still okay. I hope for all of you coming from different time zones and hectic days or not. But I want to thank everyone for your participation in the debate, in sharing your experience, Matt and Jane. This was really very good and very interesting for all of us. But also your questions, I think, pushed Jack and Marta to explain a little bit more about their research. And so thanks to everyone, to every participant, of course, in particular thanks to Jack and Marta for the time and for the preparation for these two excellent papers. And I hope that you might be able to publish them in our journal in the future, and might be willing to publish it perhaps next year in our journal for the study of religious experience, which is, by the way, to everyone, free. It's an open access journal, and you can see the link on the research, the website of the research center, just to make a little bit more advertisement for us. I think, by the way, Mike, you can stop recording.